All right, hello there. My name's Matthew Barden. I'm going to be going over my topic for this semester for this project. I'm planning on being in the class where we do this, but figured it can't hurt to do a dry run, and then I have this recording as a backup just in case something weird happens at the last minute. Um, so, like the ones we've seen so far, this is still a little bit of a work in progress. So, any suggestions that anyone might have about, you know, things to include or adjust, any comments, feel free to put those down below in the comments if you're watching the video, and I'll check those out. A link to the slides that I'm using are also on the in the description, so you'll be able to pull those up as you want, and you'll be able to go to the various links. I'm not going to be playing any of the video samples, partly for time, because I'm still fine tuning the delivery and how long this takes, but also just because copyright stuff, and this is on YouTube. So let's just get right into it. I'm calling this ruining the joke because, as you've probably heard the phrase before, if you ever have to explain what makes a joke funny, it's no longer funny. And that's exactly what I'm going to be doing. I'm going to kind of go into a little bit about, what do people find funny and why on a very, very broad level, and kind of how that is applied to things in music. And then I'm going to be specifically looking at this piece by PDQ Bach, and I'll talk a little bit about him a little bit later. Come on. There we go. All right, so what makes something funny? Believe it or not, that is a very complex question to answer. Um, but in all the things I read, I was kind of able to boil it down to just uh, two main elements. And again, this is speaking very, very broadly. Um, all right, and generally speaking, a joke, something that people laugh at, has something that gets set up at the beginning, and this has some kind of meaning to it. Right, the audience has some kind of familiarity with the context of what's going on. All right, it's some kind of shared experience between the listeners who find it funny, and then the delivery of the joke somehow subverts that context in some way. It goes against the audience expectations. And generally speaking, this surprise or this awkwardness or this just shock, it's not what we expected, causes people to laugh kind of as a reflex. So, an example of a very bad joke is, why did the chicken go to the seance? To get to the other side. Uh, so, I paused a little bit for your roaring laughter, but let's diet down. So, basically, to explain where the joke is in this little bit, um, basically, it's playing on the audience knowing two things. One, what a seance is, trying to contact the dead, um, often referred to as spirits on the other side. And then the why did the chicken cross the road jokes, wherein the setup is basically the whole point is the chicken wanted to get to the other side of the road. I don't know why that's funny, but that's just a classic old time joke. I never really I don't know. I never had the references as to exactly why it was funny growing up, but I figured best to start with. So in this case, the subversion is the getting to the other side is the punchline of the chicken joke. However, it's talking about the other side, as in, the spirit world of the seance. Ooh. You see, I paused for laughter there, but it wasn't as funny because I explained it. All right. So, moving on to humor in music, it follows these same kinds of rules. Okay, there's generally some kind of setup and some kind of subversion of this setup based on our expectations of what we're hearing orally. I'm not going to play it in this video, but again, you have the slides and you can pull up this recording here. This is a Bernstein lecture going on about just humor in music. Um, and he references a bunch of stuff. Specifically, it opens up with Mozart's The Musical Joke, which I think modern listeners, if they just heard this without any context, wouldn't necessarily find it funny, just kind of weird. And that's because Mozart plays with those expectations that his audience at the time, being 18th century music listeners, would have had. Whether it's the form or the voice leading or the harmony, he is playing with those expectations of the audience and changing that. In the particular sample, the harmony, you would expect the well formed progression to end, but he just twists and distorts everything that's going on with. Again, what we would find kind of like that was a weird way to end the phrase, but at the time it would have thrown a lot of people off guard. Um, So again, you can play around with these. You don't have to use a harmony as long as you set up some kind of expectation for the listener, whether it be in the melody, harmony, rhythm, and so on and so forth. You can create a joke in music basically by following these same things. Quotations are another big one, and I'll talk a little bit about quotations when we get into the piece specifically. No, I don't want to play that because copyrights. All right. Diving in a little bit more specifically, I wanted to mention three different kinds of jokes, specifically parody, spoof, and satire. So the point of this upcoming work that we're going to look at um, is that it's mimicking and making fun of a lot of different things, and I'm going to talk about some specific instances of all of that. But when you do that, you run into these kinds of humor. So again, when you're mimicking something, if it's a parody of something, I'm sure you've probably heard this word before. A parody would be kind of making fun of a specific thing through imitation. If you've ever heard any of the music by Weird Al, he is parodying specific songs. All right, he's changing up the words so that we have the expectation of the words in the music, but by changing the words to be something else, that is creating a parody and subverting our expectations. A spoof is similar to a parody, only it's much more broad. Right, it's talking about the something as a whole. The kind of early 2000s movie series, a scary movie. Those movies are like this because they don't specifically parody one specific movie. I mean, they have a general focus, but they're parodying just the trope of horror movies in general. Um, and then a satire, it can be like a spoof or a parody or something else, but generally it serves as a commentary about whatever it is that's being um, satired. So again, if you're making a joke about something to make a point, that would be the satire, whereas just the parody and spoof can just be for their own sake. All right. So I want you to just keep those in mind as we move forward. I'm going to start diving into a little bit of the composer and the piece. Moving on, but I'm going to look at a few specific instances of some jokes that I find to be some of the more apparent ones throughout the piece, and I've got one of each of these. All right. So who is PDQ Bach? So it's a fictional character made up by Peter Schickele, and I could go into a whole bunch about his background, but I won't for the sake of time. But basically, this whole fictional scenario, this entire thing is a joke and a spoof slash parody of Bach and classical slash Baroque slash romantic slash that whole classical with a big C group of composers. Um, he's kind of advertising all the music as being a professor at the I typoed right here, but the University of Northern South Dakota at Hoople. That is not a school that exists. I had to do a little bit of research about that actually as I was doing this project. I just thought it was a real school I'd never heard of, with a ironic name. But that in itself is a joke. This persona of Shikali's is what he uses for writing a lot of his music. Um, and again, specifically that with kind of a humorous tone or theme, or is wanting to parody something specific. Um, I could go into a lot of details, but I've actually got it's just a picture, but right up above me, he's actually written a book that is the definitive biography of PDQ Bach. PDQ Bach has his own, canon and history into everything that makes him up for what he is, even though he's a fake person. So I definitely recommend checking it out. It's a very humorous and interesting read. It's not the point of this paper to go into that, but it's a good read. You can find it online. Not sponsored. All right. One of the things is that, yeah, in the story, he was the last son of Bach, who at that point didn't really care because he had a lot of kids and just gave him the initials PDQ with no meaning. But we, as the listeners, understand the context of PDQ. Stands for the abbreviation "pretty damn quick," as opposed to the just the initials Bach that we might expect from J.S. Bach, CPE Bach, things like that. It's PDQ. That's the name. So again, that in itself is a bit of a joke. Shikely stays relevant into this scenario. He's kind of assumes the role of the musicologist who is done a lot of research about PDQ and is presenting his music for the musicological societies of the world to appreciate, and that's kind of the context of this piece as well. Um, that piece being Oedipus Tex. So this is a dramatic oratorio or an opera. There's two versions in one act, written in 1989. It's very standard for this kind of thing. Might be a little short. I'm not an expert on all um, oratorios, but about 30 minutes. The plot. I'll talk very briefly about the plot, but it is the Oedipus story from ancient Greece. The twist and the first main joke is that instead of being set in Greece, it's set in the town of Thebes Gulch, Texas. So this is a western, but it's also Oedipus. I've just got a list of all the various different songs on the album. So again, you can kind of find the different ones. But it's set up just like a normal oratorio. Instead of we got a prologue, going back between arios and recitatives, the chorus, the orchestra. It's all very traditional of these late Baroque, early classical oratorios. Um, and actually, I'll mention that right here. Another type. I need to fix these typos. So again, it's going to be a spoof of these, specifically because it's not specifically referencing a specific oratorio, and I'm saying referencing in the fact of something like Weird Al, where it's parodying a very specific one. Again, I don't know every oratorio, so if someone happens to listen to this and be like, "Oh, that's exactly like blah 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 blah," put that in the comments or let me know when I do this live. I'd love to hear that. But where this becomes a bit of a spoof is this kind of irreverent nature throughout the whole thing. And it basically just goes against basically every other oratorio written in this time period, which at this point are becoming more and more religious in nature. It's essentially part of a church service. For those of you who don't know, an oratorio, it's basically an opera without the theater component. That's basically it. I will say I do find some interesting similarities between Stravinsky's Oedipus Rex and this piece because they both open in a similar fashion. I think that's just part of the way that PDQ Bach pulls on the shared experiences of the listeners. Because in my opinion, in the 20th century, I don't think you could write something parodying Oedipus Rex without at least acknowledging that this large operatic work earlier in the century existed by one of the more famous composers of the century. But basically, the openings are have a similar vibe. They're breaking down a word and playing with the syllabic content over and over again. Um, I think that's cool and a neat reference, but I don't think it continues enough to make this a parody of Oedipus Rex, but rather just a spoof of it in general. I'd love to learn to look a little bit more into this, but that's not what I'm focusing on for this paper. I don't want to play it. There we go. All right. For those of you who don't know, I'm going to really quickly summarize the plot. Um, it's on the screen. Moving on. Again, that's not any part of what I'm looking for. What I'm going to talk about now are some of the specific instances of jokes that I find are pretty funny and upfront in this composition. So, the whole kind of setup of this with the introduction is that Shickley found this work and wants to get it performed, but there's no money in the arts. So he puts some product placement into the finale of the piece, and basically that's it. Trying to drive up money so that way it could be sponsored and performed. And that's kind of the whole setup for the introduction. Again, I've got a link to the album performance in these slides. You can check that out. So I find this one funny and a bit of satire on just the musological society, and then just funding in the arts in general, that we'd have to resort to this kind of thing just to get music performed. The timing is something that I think is also effective here, because this is set up in the introduction to the performance. This isn't actually in the score itself. So again, unless you have the full program notes or you're listening to the album recording, all of a sudden you'll be in the finale and the lines "drink Pepsi" come in and come out in the finale. Something that would be very shocking and a little jarring. That again lead to that sudden departation and subversion of what you've expected to have gone on in the previous 28 minutes of the piece. There's also a quote here. The quote, "Girls just want to have fun." I'm sure you're familiar with that one. That came out a few years before this piece did. So Shickley knew the audience would at least be tangentially familiar with this. The context of what's happening here, this is part of the aria that's sung right before Oedipus's mother wife kills herself. So there's a very stark contrast between what's happening and what's being sung. And again, queens just want to have fun. That's the line there, and it sings the melody line from this, and then she kills herself. That whole dichotomy between these, that cognitive dissonance of what's going on, this peppy, upbeat tune, just comes completely out of nowhere. And that shock is what, drives people to be like, wait, what? And then they're playing on that, the audience being familiar with the melody and the song, "Girls Just Want to Have Fun." And that all of a sudden those relationships and those connotations come into play, and that's where that reference comes in, and that's kind of where a bit of that humor comes in, because again, you wouldn't expect that in a song that's the mother wife lamenting over her choices before hanging herself. So there's that. The next one, I explain here, I'm going to move along for the sake of time, is just explicitly stating in the opening that this is a tragedy. This is the same opening that I mentioned before, and again, the Greek chorus is just singing again, the word tragedy over and over and over again, and explaining just what a tragedy is and why we're watching one, and all of that. The idea of this in the classic sense is you would have a chorus that would come in and explain the moral of the story. which again, this is an unexpected moral. Basically, don't marry your mother. Um, that's it. It doesn't have the moral of the actual Oedipus story that it's parodying. Um, I should say this is a parody of Oedipus. Mentioned that before, but anyways, but this is usually something that is not explicitly stated at the very beginning of the the story. You know, you're developing the drama of what you're watching. You know, how will Macbeth get through this scenario? Oh, no, he didn't. Things like that. Figure this out over the context of it. This is essentially spoiling the plot right at the beginning. Something that would be unexpected, and again, throw into this what's what's going on. We don't know what's happening. And again, that's it all very briefly overviewed there. Again, I've got a recording to this right here, and in my kind of real world presentation of this, we'll just kind of play little clips just to show off each of these at the beginning and at the end. There's more in the beginning, in the middle, I should say. But for the sake of time, I'm going to wrap it out here. So thank you all very much for watching. And again, if you have any questions or concerns or things to adjust or go on, I would love to hear that. Just drop those